August 12, 1989, and the small town of Harlan, Kentucky, nestled in the Appalachian Mountains, was experiencing a typical Saturday evening with families enjoying the last weeks of summer before school resumed. The Starlight Cinema on Main Street was showing the summer's biggest movies, and teenagers gathered there as they did every weekend, the theater serving as the social hub for young people in a town of 6,000 residents. Jacob Reed was 17 years old that Saturday, a high school senior with sandy blonde hair, blue eyes, and an easy smile that made him popular among classmates at Harlan High School. He was tall and athletic, a member of the basketball team with plans to attend the University of Kentucky on a partial scholarship, and he wore his Letterman jacket over a white t-shirt and jeans. Emily Foster was 16, a junior with long brown hair, hazel eyes, and a quiet intelligence that made her a favorite among teachers, and she'd been dating Jacob for 8 months after meeting in chemistry class. She wore a denim jacket over a floral dress, white sneakers, and a silver necklace her grandmother had given her for her 16th birthday, just 2 months earlier. Jacob and Emily had gone to the 7 p.m. showing of Batman with a group of friends, sitting in the back row of the theater and sharing popcorn while watching Michael Keaton battle the Joker on screen. The movie ended at 9:15 p.m., and the group of 6 teenagers walked out into the warm August evening, standing in the theater parking lot discussing their plans for the rest of the evening. Jacob's friends Tommy Henderson and Sarah Mitchell were going to a party at a classmate's house, and they invited Jacob and Emily to come along, but the couple declined, saying they wanted to spend time alone. "We're just going to drive around for a while," Jacob told his friends at approximately 9:25 p.m. "Maybe go out to Miller's Point to look at the stars. We'll see you guys Monday at school." Emily waved goodbye to her friends as she and Jacob walked to his car, a red 1984 Chevrolet Camaro that Jacob had bought with money saved from his job at his father's hardware store, parked near the back of the cinema lot. The group watched Jacob and Emily get into the Camaro, and they heard the engine start before Jacob backed out of the parking space and drove toward the exit onto Main Street. That was the last confirmed sighting of Jacob Reed and Emily Foster alive, and what happened to them after they left the Starlight Cinema parking lot remains one of Kentucky's most tragic mysteries finally solved decades later. At 11:30 p.m., Jacob's mother Carol called Emily's parents when Jacob hadn't returned home by his midnight curfew, and Emily's father Richard said his daughter wasn't home either, and he was starting to worry. By midnight, both sets of parents were calling friends trying to locate the teenagers, and when nobody had seen Jacob or Emily since they'd left the cinema, genuine fear began setting in. Jacob's father Daniel drove to Miller's Point, a scenic overlook about 5 miles outside Harlan where teenagers often went to be alone, but he found no sign of the red Camaro or the missing teens. At 1 a.m., the Harlan police were contacted, and Officer Michael Hayes began checking areas where teenagers typically gathered, looking for the distinctive red Camaro that should have been easy to spot. At 2:15 a.m., a night security guard at the abandoned Harlan Coal Company facility on the edge of town noticed a red car parked near the old loading docks, and he called police to report what appeared to be a suspicious vehicle. Officer Hayes arrived at the coal facility within 10 minutes and found Jacob's red Camaro parked with its engine off, doors unlocked, and keys still in the ignition, but no sign of Jacob or Emily anywhere. In the hours between leaving the cinema at 9:25 p.m. and the car being found at 2:15 a.m., 2 teenagers had vanished from a small Kentucky town without anyone seeing or hearing what happened to them. If you want to hear how DNA finally solved this decades-old tragedy, make sure you're subscribed, hit that like button, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's see what happened next. The Camaro's interior was examined and showed no signs of struggle, with Emily's purse sitting on the passenger seat containing her wallet and ID, and Jacob's Letterman jacket folded neatly in the back seat. The keys in the ignition and unlocked doors suggested the teenagers had exited the vehicle willingly, perhaps thinking they'd return shortly, but they'd never made it back to the car. The abandoned coal facility was a sprawling complex of old buildings and equipment that had been closed since 1975, and it was located in an isolated area where few people had reason to go, especially at night. Police searched the facility throughout the night, checking inside buildings and around the property, calling Jacob and Emily's names into the darkness, but finding no trace of the missing teenagers. By Sunday morning, over 100 volunteers had joined Harlan police in searching the coal facility and surrounding areas, checking every building, every piece of abandoned equipment, and every wooded section where 2 teenagers might have gone or been taken. Bloodhounds were brought in from Lexington and given scent samples from clothing in Jacob and Emily's bedrooms, and the dogs tracked from the Camaro toward one of the old coal processing buildings before losing the trail. The fact that the scent led toward the building suggested Jacob and Emily had walked in that direction, but why they would have gone into a dangerous abandoned facility at night remained a disturbing mystery. FBI Special Agent Catherine Wells arrived from the Louisville field office on Sunday afternoon and immediately took over what was now being treated as a potential double abduction, or worse. Agent Wells interviewed Jacob and Emily's friends extensively about the couple's relationship and whether they'd mentioned plans to go anywhere besides Miller's Point after leaving the cinema. They seemed totally normal and happy, Tommy Henderson explained. Jacob was joking around and Emily was laughing. There was nothing that suggested they were worried about anything or planning to meet someone. The cinema parking lot was examined for witnesses who might have seen someone following Jacob's Camaro when it left, but the Saturday night crowd had dispersed, and nobody reported seeing anything unusual. The abandoned coal facility became the focus of intensive investigation, with structural engineers brought in to assess which buildings were safe to search and which were too dangerous to enter. Several buildings had partially collapsed roofs and floors that could give way, creating hazards for searchers, but every accessible area was examined thoroughly looking for any sign of the missing teenagers. Agent Wells theorized that someone might have lured Jacob and Emily to the coal facility, perhaps claiming to have car trouble or pretending to need help, and then attacked them when they arrived. But this theory struggled to explain why the Camaro had been left with keys in the ignition, suggesting whoever took Jacob and Emily hadn't needed or wanted the vehicle. Jacob's father Daniel insisted his son would never have willingly gone to the coal facility, that Jacob knew it was dangerous and off-limits, and something must have forced or tricked them into going there. Emily's mother Susan agreed, saying Emily was cautious and wouldn't have agreed to explore an abandoned industrial site at night, and both parents believed their children had been targeted by someone. By Monday, the case had become state news with Jacob and Emily's photos appearing on television across Kentucky, and tips began flooding in from people claiming to have seen the teenagers or the red Camaro. One witness reported seeing a red car matching the Camaro's description, being followed by a dark pickup truck on Highway 38, around 10 p.m. Saturday, but the witness couldn't provide details about the truck or its driver. This lead was investigated extensively, with police checking registrations for dark pickup trucks in the region, but thousands of vehicles matched the vague description, and no specific suspect emerged. The theory that Jacob and Emily had been victims of a random crime by someone who happened to be at the coal facility was explored, but investigators found no evidence of anyone else being at the abandoned site recently. Jacob and Emily's relationship was examined to rule out a murder-suicide scenario, but friends and family insisted the couple was happy and stable, with no indication of problems or suicidal thoughts. Both teenagers had good grades, supportive families, and bright futures ahead of them, and there was simply no motive for them to harm themselves or each other. By late August, the intensive daily search operations had been scaled back after weeks of effort, produced no bodies, no additional evidence, and no credible leads about what had happened to the teenagers. The red Camaro was released to Jacob's family, and Daniel couldn't bring himself to drive it or sell it, so it sat covered in the garage as a painful reminder of the son who'd never come home. The case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries in early 1990, and the broadcast generated thousands of tips from across the country, but investigation revealed each lead was either mistaken identity or someone trying to help with inaccurate information. Carol and Susan formed a support group for parents of missing children in Kentucky, channeling their grief into helping others navigate the nightmare of not knowing what had happened to their loved ones. The months became years, and Jacob Reed and Emily Foster became two more names in the tragic list of teenagers who'd vanished in the 1980s and were never found despite exhaustive searches. Age progression photos were created showing what Jacob and Emily might look like at 25, then 35, then 45, though their families knew in their hearts that the teenagers had likely died in August 1989. The abandoned coal facility was eventually demolished in 1995, and before the buildings came down, search teams went through one final time looking for any evidence that might have been missed, but they found nothing. The years accumulated slowly for the Reed and Foster families, with 1989 becoming 2000 and then 2010, and both families carried the weight of not knowing what had happened to their children on that August night. Daniel Reed died in 2008 at age 64 from a heart attack that his doctors attributed to years of unrelenting stress and grief, and he died without ever knowing what had happened to Jacob. Carol Reed lived another 15 years but never recovered emotionally from losing her son, and she kept Jacob's bedroom exactly as he'd left it the night he'd gone to the cinema with Emily. Richard and Susan Foster's marriage survived against odds, both understanding that separating would mean losing the only other person who truly understood the depth of their loss and carried the same memories. Emily's younger sister Amanda, who'd been 12 when Emily disappeared, grew up in the shadow of the missing sister, and she became a victim's advocate working with families of missing persons. Detective James Morrison took over the cold case in 2015 when he joined Kentucky State Police, and he reviewed the file hoping that modern technology might reveal something investigators in 1989 had missed. Morrison used advanced database searches to look for similar cases, teenagers who disappeared from small towns under comparable circumstances, and he found several unsolved cases from the 1980s and early 1990s. But attempts to connect these cases to a single perpetrator found no concrete evidence linking them beyond general similarities, and no suspect emerged who had connections to multiple locations. The coal facility location continued to trouble investigators because it was such a specific and isolated place, suggesting whoever had taken Jacob and Emily had knowledge of the area and had chosen the location deliberately. Morrison interviewed elderly residents who'd worked at the coal facility before it closed in 1975, asking if anyone knew of hidden areas or underground tunnels where bodies might have been concealed. Several former workers mentioned that the facility had extensive underground conveyor systems and storage areas, and some of these spaces had been sealed when the mine closed, potentially creating hidden locations. This revelation led to ground-penetrating radar surveys of the former coal facility site in 2016, searching for any anomalies that might indicate buried remains or sealed underground spaces. The surveys identified several areas of interest, and excavation crews spent weeks digging and exploring, but they found only old mining equipment and structural remnants with no sign of Jacob or Emily. By 2020, Jacob would have been 48 and Emily would have been 47, ages that made their families imagine the lives they would have lived and the families they might have raised. True crime podcasts discovered the case in the late 2010s, and several shows featured detailed episodes analyzing the evidence and proposing theories about what might have happened at the coal facility. Some podcasters suggested the teenagers had been killed by someone who worked security at the abandoned facility, perhaps someone who'd been using the location for illegal activities and had eliminated witnesses. But investigation into who'd had access to the coal facility in 1989 found no credible suspects, and the property had been largely unsecured with no formal security presence. In October 2023, hikers discovered human remains in a remote wooded area about 15 miles from the former coal facility, in a section of Daniel Boone National Forest, rarely visited by people. The remains were scattered by animals and weather over what appeared to be a significant time period, and Kentucky State Police were called to investigate what might be a crime scene. Detective Sarah Chen from the Cold Case Unit was contacted because the location was relatively close to where Jacob and Emily had disappeared, and she immediately thought about the 34-year-old unsolved case. The remains were collected carefully and transported to the State Forensic Laboratory in Frankfurt, and preliminary analysis suggested they'd been in the forest for decades, based on deterioration and vegetation growth patterns. Chen requested that DNA be extracted from the remains and compared against profiles from unsolved missing persons cases, and specifically asked that Jacob Reed and Emily Foster be included in the comparison. The DNA extraction process took several weeks because the remains were so degraded, but forensic scientists were able to recover sufficient genetic material for analysis and comparison. Carol Reed, now 81 and in declining health, received a call from Detective Chen in November 2023, asking if she could provide an updated DNA sample for comparison against remains that had been discovered. "Have you found Jacob?" Carol asked immediately, her voice shaking. And Chen explained carefully that remains had been found but identification hadn't been confirmed yet. Susan Foster received a similar call, and both mothers provided DNA samples while trying to prepare themselves emotionally for news they'd been dreading for 34 years. The DNA analysis took 3 weeks, and when results came back in early December 2023, they confirmed that the remains belonged to both Jacob Reed and Emily Foster, found together in the forest where they'd been for over 3 decades. The confirmation that Jacob and Emily had been found, though deceased as expected, sent waves of grief and relief through both families who'd spent 34 years wondering where their children were. The discovery of Jacob and Emily's remains transformed the case from a missing persons investigation into a homicide, and forensic teams returned to the forest location to conduct a thorough examination of the scene. The area where the remains were found was extremely remote, accessible only by hiking through dense forest with no trails or roads nearby, suggesting whoever had brought the teenagers there had known the terrain well. Forensic anthropologists examined the remains and determined that both Jacob and Emily had suffered trauma consistent with gunshot wounds, and scattered bullet fragments were recovered from the surrounding soil. The ballistics evidence suggested they'd been killed with a .38 caliber handgun, a common weapon in the 1980s, and the remains had been left at the location rather than buried, allowing nature to scatter them over decades. Detective Chen coordinated with FBI forensic experts to process every piece of evidence from the scene, and they discovered additional items that had been overlooked by the hikers who'd initially found the remains. A deteriorated wallet was found containing Jacob's driver's license, and fragments of fabric matching Emily's denim jacket were recovered, confirming the victims' identities beyond the DNA evidence. Most significantly, investigators found a corroded metal tag from a keychain that bore the logo of Harlan Coal Company employee number 247, suggesting a possible connection to someone who'd worked at the facility. This discovery sent Chen scrambling through old employment records from the coal company, looking for anyone who'd been employee number 247 and might have had access to the abandoned facility in 1989. The records showed that employee number 247 had been Curtis Brennan, a security supervisor who'd worked at the facility from 1968 until it closed in 1975, and who'd reportedly continued visiting the site after closure. Chen immediately investigated Curtis Brennan's background and discovered he'd died in 2019 at age 76. But his criminal history revealed a disturbing pattern that had never been connected to Jacob and Emily's disappearance. Brennan had been arrested in 1992 for assault with a deadly weapon after threatening a teenager who'd been trespassing on property Brennan owned, and the weapon had been a .38 caliber handgun. The case had been pleaded down to a misdemeanor, and Brennan had received probation, but the incident established that he'd owned the type of weapon used to kill Jacob and Emily. Further investigation revealed that Brennan had lived alone on a rural property about 10 miles from the coal facility, and he'd been known locally as a recluse who didn't tolerate people on what he considered his territory. Former neighbors interviewed in 2023 recalled that Brennan had been obsessive about the old coal facility, claiming it was still his, even after it closed, and he'd chased away teenagers who went there to explore. He called that coal plant his property even though he didn't own it, one neighbor recalled. He'd drive out there at night sometimes to make sure nobody was messing around, said kids had no business being there. This revelation created a clear motive. Brennan had likely seen Jacob's Camaro at the coal facility, confronted the teenagers for trespassing, and the situation had escalated to violence. Chen obtained a court order to exhume Brennan's body for DNA comparison against evidence from the crime scene, hoping to find definitive proof linking him to the murders. The exhumation and DNA analysis took 6 weeks, and in February 2024, the results confirmed that DNA found on fabric fragments at the scene matched Curtis Brennan's genetic profile. Additionally, ballistics experts were able to match the bullet fragments recovered from the forest to a .38 caliber handgun that had been in police evidence since Brennan's 1992 arrest. The weapon had been returned to Brennan after his probation ended, and it was found among his possessions after his death in 2019, but nobody had thought to test it against unsolved cases until now. Forensic testing in 2024 confirmed that this specific weapon had fired the bullets that killed Jacob Reed and Emily Foster, providing conclusive evidence that Curtis Brennan had murdered both teenagers. The investigation revealed that Brennan had likely encountered Jacob and Emily at the coal facility, possibly when they'd stopped to look at the abandoned buildings out of curiosity, and he'd confronted them with his gun. When the situation escalated, Brennan had shot both teenagers, then driven their bodies 15 miles into the national forest in his pickup truck, leaving them in a location he believed would never be discovered. He'd returned to the coal facility and left Jacob's Camaro with the keys in the ignition, perhaps hoping police would think the teenagers had run away. or met with foul play somewhere else. Carol Reed received the news that her son's killer had been identified on February 14, 2024, and while she was grateful for answers, the fact that Brennan had died without facing justice was bittersweet. "Jacob has been gone for 34 years, Carol said through tears, and the man who took him from us lived another 30 years free, died peacefully, and never had to answer for what he did." Susan and Richard Foster expressed similar sentiments, grateful to finally know what had happened to Emily, but devastated that Curtis Brennan would never face trial or punishment for murdering their daughter. The resolution of Jacob and Emily's case made national headlines in early 2024. A 34-year-old double homicide finally solved through advances in DNA technology and determined investigation by detectives who refused to give up. Kentucky State Police held a press conference in March 2024, announcing that Curtis Brennan had been conclusively identified as the person responsible for killing Jacob Reed and Emily Foster in August 1989. Detective Chen presented the evidence publicly: DNA linking Brennan to the crime scene, ballistics matching his weapon to the bullets that killed the teenagers, and his documented obsession with the coal facility where their car had been found. While Curtis Brennan will never face trial because he died in 2019, Chen told reporters, "We can say with certainty that he murdered Jacob Reed and Emily Foster, and this case is now officially closed and solved." The families held a joint memorial service in April 2024, finally able to properly lay Jacob and Emily to rest after their remains had been returned following forensic examination. Hundreds of people attended the service in Harlan, including classmates who were now in their early 50s and had never forgotten the friends who disappeared after a movie on a summer night. Carol Reed, who'd spent 34 years wondering where her son was, stood at Jacob's grave and told him she'd never stopped searching and was grateful he'd finally been found. "I wish I could have brought you home sooner," Carol whispered. "But you're home now and I know what happened, and you can rest in peace knowing your killer was identified even if he never faced justice." Susan and Richard Foster buried Emily beside her grandmother, who'd given her the silver necklace found with her remains, a small piece of jewelry that had survived decades in the forest. Amanda Foster, Emily's younger sister who was now 47, spoke at the service about growing up without her sister and how the uncertainty had haunted their family for over 3 decades. "We lived in limbo for 34 years, Amanda said, not knowing if Emily was dead or alive, if she'd suffered, if we'd ever have answers. And while the truth is painful, it's also a gift because now we can grieve properly and move forward." The case brought renewed attention to the importance of preserving evidence and maintaining DNA databases, because the key chain tag that led to Curtis Brennan had been overlooked for decades. If the hikers hadn't discovered the remains in 2023, or if the key chain hadn't been found, or if DNA technology hadn't advanced sufficiently, Jacob and Emily's murders might never have been solved. Detective Chen used the case as an example in training seminars for law enforcement, emphasizing that cold cases can be solved decades later if investigators remain persistent and utilize every available tool. The resolution also highlighted the dangers of individuals who become obsessively territorial about abandoned properties, and Kentucky passed legislation in 2024 requiring better security and monitoring of closed industrial sites. Curtis Brennan's family issued a statement expressing shock and sorrow about the discoveries, saying they'd had no idea he was capable of murder, and offering condolences to the Reed and Foster families. Brennan's property was searched extensively in 2024, and investigators found journals where he'd written about protecting the coal facility from trespassers, though he never explicitly mentioned Jacob and Emily. The journals revealed a man who'd become increasingly paranoid and territorial in his later years, convinced that the abandoned facility was still his responsibility, even though he had no legal claim to it. Forensic psychologists who reviewed Brennan's writings suggested he'd likely confronted Jacob and Emily, believing he was defending his property, and when they didn't leave immediately, his paranoia had escalated to deadly violence. The red Camaro that had sat in Daniel Reed's garage for years was finally sold in 2024, with Carol explaining that knowing what happened allowed her to finally let go of the physical reminders. Jacob's Letterman jacket and Emily's purse, which had been in the car when it was found, were given to their respective families as keepsakes to remember the teenagers who'd been taken too soon. Tommy Henderson and Sarah Mitchell, who'd been the last friends to see Jacob and Emily alive, attended the memorial service and spoke about their guilt over letting the couple leave alone that night. "We've carried this for 34 years, Tommy said, wondering if things would have been different if we'd insisted they come to the party with us. But we were kids and we had no way of knowing what was about to happen." The Starlight Cinema where Jacob and Emily had watched their last movie closed in 2010, but the building still stands on Main Street, and a memorial plaque was installed in 2024 honoring the two teenagers. Carol Reed lived to see her son's case solved, a resolution she'd prayed for through 34 years of not knowing, though she died in September 2024 at age 82, just months after Jacob's burial. Her obituary mentioned that she was survived by her son Jacob, finally at rest after being found and brought home, and that she dedicated her life to searching for him and supporting other families of missing persons. The case proved that even when perpetrators die before being brought to justice, modern forensic science can still provide answers and closure to families who've waited decades for the truth. And it demonstrated that cold cases, no matter how old, deserve continued investigation because advances in technology create new opportunities to solve mysteries that once seemed impossible. Jacob Reed and Emily Foster's story reminds us that DNA technology is revolutionizing cold case investigations, that patient detective work can triumph over decades of silence, and that the murdered deserve to have their stories told even when justice comes too late. In Harlan, Kentucky, where two teenagers went to a movie on a summer night in 1989 and never came home, their memory lives on in the people who loved them and in the resolution that finally brought them peace. The memorial at their gravesite reads Jacob Reed and Emily Foster, together in life and death lost 1989, found 2023, forever remembered, acknowledging the tragedy that took them and the long journey to bring them home. And every August 12th, the anniversary of their disappearance, the community of Harlan holds a candlelight vigil honoring Jacob and Emily and all victims of violence who've been lost and found through the dedication of those who refuse to forget. The case stands as testament to the power of modern forensic science, the importance of never giving up on the missing, and the reality that sometimes answers come decades after questions were first asked, bringing closure even when justice is impossible.